Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the institutional support funders, hosts of this amazing conference. I've just arrived. I can already see the buzz and the interaction. And that obviously includes the Department of Education, the Namibian Arts Council, efficacy, I hope I pronounced that right, and then any other institutional supports, and also any sort of many of the distinguished guests here. Particular thanks as well to Rosemary for getting me here, persuading me to come. The shortcomings, of course, in this presentation are all mine, as I say as a disclaimer. But anyway, it's great to be here. And I'm not an expert in leadership, although the title is cultural leadership. But it was a good chance for me to look at some of these areas, look at questions of agency and structure, and reflect upon it. Look at some of the new scholarship and some of the issues that come through, and also to get some sense of how this interplay works. Not only in advanced economies, which where a lot of the locus of the work is actually done in terms of the CCIs, particularly in terms of beneficiating and making profits. But also to look at emerging and developing economies and start asking questions as to how we go about it, how we, in some respects, play catch-up. I've got a range of slides, and I will try and move quite quickly through those, but there will be, presumably, time and question-answer session for us to actually look more directly or touch directly on some of these issues and matters. So we look at the role of cultural leadership and strengthening the creative economy. This was what Rosemary and I discussed. So in the past, decades, or sort of, in the 70s and before, creativity in industry and creative economy didn't quite sit together. They weren't generally linked, but this has changed over time. So in the new economies of the 21st century, there's a whole range of new forms of value being created. So while the industrial economy used mostly labor and capital, here the new economy uses creative industries to produce meanings from the world of ideas. So ideas, creativity have their own value, have their own meaning, and they and increasingly are part of processes of beneficiating, adding value. These sorts of ideas have been spread in a range of levels and forums. The work of governments moving into the creative economy sector, looking at traditional arts culture management, arts culture departments, but also a whole range of popular works. Some of the more well-known ones by Richard Florida and John Hawkins, looking to the growth of discourses, whether on the creative class, which is seen as something broader than just a formal economic sector, or looking more specifically at the creative economy and how one actually can, as Hawkins says, how one can actually derive value, use ideas, raise businesses and make money. Cultural production itself is changing. Conventional views of the individual creative artists are still here, but they're being replaced in part by our new views of creativity as a social process, and the social process embedded within organizational and institutional contexts. So with the rise of these, with the creative economy, the cultural creative industry sector, the leadership models themselves are changing, and this has been part of a broader process. So the application of cultural leadership, it's wider and deeper than it has been traditionally, but also it carries with it a number of contradictions and complexities. Just anecdotally, because I've often found looking at blogs is sometimes a better way of doing contemporary scholarship than only relying on articles, because articles scholarly articles take sometimes 3 to 4 years to come through. So you've got a 2018 article has probably been its gestation as the 2014. So looking at a range of blogs, you often pick up things that you don't always pick up through the more formal literature. And I was looking at a whole range of anecdotal experiences, and they're worldwide. But I was looking at the New England, creative economy sector, which generates just this little sector, and we know it's got a dense set of networks and universities and creative industries and so on and so forth. It's well funded, but it generates around 17 billion for the region per annum. And even the spokesperson, and these are people working at local and regional level. He says, because arts and culture is such an important part of the regional economy, interwoven in the fabric of a vibrant place to live, we need to nurture, support, and to promote the sector in the same way as we would do any other business sector. So I'm not saying that we can't look at the privileged and the amazing space that culture operates, but to take cognizance of how the interaction between culture and the world of work, culture, and new economic forms of production are happening. If we don't, we actually continue to lose competitive advantage. The shift, obviously, to the CCIs and the creative economy is not without its problems. For some, the beneficiation of culture, the notion of the beneficiation of culture is seen as too instrumental. And it also comes at a time, and we must bear this in mind, when direct public spending on the arts is declining globally. So governments are looking for alternatives. And these alternatives are not always as supportive or embracing as they once would have been. For some, these developments are manifestations of neoliberalism. But other left-leaning scholars, however, caution against such a view, stressing the need for a more sophisticated and critical engagement with the creative economy and associated constructs. Simon Williams of the British Council, he says, we are now in a transitional period when you stop thinking of culture as an added bonus to something important and take it as a vital part of the economy. Nevertheless, challenges remain, both for, and particularly for emerging and developing economies. You only have to look what's happening to Turkey with, pressures in terms of trade at the moment. So these challenges include the budgetary pressures on the state, trade inequalities, how to leverage domestic resources and funding for the CCI sector, and these imperatives impact on leadership and policy in the national economies in question. So to look at section 1 and a number of points to make here, the creative economy. Most of you are familiar. I'll just run through some of the highlights. According to UNCTAD Stat, trade in creative goods and services has more than doubled from 208 billion in 2002 to 509 billion in 2015, and it's increasing. The global creative economy in the period 2002 to 15 has realized an average 7.3% annual growth, outstripping most, if not all, sectors. The first Ernst Young EY global survey found in 2015 creative industries accounted for 3% of the world's gross domestic product, around 2.25 trillion, creating around 30 million jobs, which is more jobs than all the auto industries across the world collectively. The contribution to GDP of the sector does vary, from around 20% in Chile to over 10% in Brazil. But people are often working off different bases, and there's not one standardized, uniform notion of exactly what constitutes the culture and creative industries and how you grid this. But we're working towards that. In South Africa, for example, in 2014 surveys estimated that just under 3% of an estimated 450,000 jobs were employed in the creative economy. But if you look at the greater creative economy, not only in explicit or actual creative industries and cultural industries, and people working in other parts of the industrial sector, we're looking, the greater sector, creative economy is responsible for almost 7% of GDP. It's a significant amount, and that's in South Africa. And that can be grown further. So such developments are conditioned by the expansion of the digital economy, the accompanying growth of copyright industries, and this is really important, is how important intellectual property copyright is, and I have a figure that will just illustrate that. But bearing in mind in this whole process that definitions and classifications of what constitutes the creative industry or the creative industries are fluid. That just shows you those countries that have the percentage of copyright-based creative industries. And you can see the BRICS economies are lagging somewhat there. China's made some good strides of late. But South Korea, years ago, was really putting a huge amount of effort into its copyright regime and that. And South Africa's got I'm talking from South Africa, we can talk about Southern Africa, but I can just think of the number of areas where we've had competitive advantage and we actually haven't got the copyright. One of the most famous examples of that is that, if you our coastal areas where you've got what you call dolosa, these concrete barriers that they use to interlink and stop erosion. This was the person who developed it, an engineer in East London, said, no, I'm not interested in copyright. I'm doing it for the public good. Had he done so, South Africa would be, getting quite a fair amount of revenue, which hopefully would have spread into the SADC countries more generally. So the creative economy and the CCIs. So this is as I said, it's a fluid situation. And there was talk on the cultural industries dating right back to the 1930s. People, Horkheimer, Adorno, of the Frankfurt School. But in the 70s, cultural industries emerged as something of an object of scholarly and policy interest, but not so much in terms of their commercial aspects, but broader aspects. In the 80s, there was a gradual realization that culture itself was changing. It was expanding and in a range of ways were more popular forms. And you found a whole range of interesting developments on a policy basis and also in the universities. One of the most famous was the Birmingham Centre of Contemporary Cultural Studies, which did a whole range of work on things like working class culture and so on and so forth. But the concept of creative industries, and you can probably find it lurking around, maybe even a bit earlier, but it seems to have been grounded in 1994 in the Australian government's new cultural policy document called the Creative Nation. So this is a bit of one of the start of this kind of discourse. This was followed up in 1998 by the new Blair administration, a newly minted Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which replaced the Department of National Heritage, and sport also was part of it. Introduced a seminal document which stressed the importance of mapping, gridding the creative economy. It was called Creative Industries Mapping Document, and they identified 13 odd industries. This was actually something serendipitous. It just happened to be the particular industries in the portfolio. And one of the reasons why the ministry is formed and why the government did it, they wanted to make the portfolio, quote unquote, more sexy. So it wasn't just funding the public arts; it was actually to grow that. So by the late 1990s, the idea of creative industries gained traction. And this was accompanied by broader notion of the creative economy also starting to percolate throughout the sectors and also through into the popular imagination. And by the late 2000s, the notion of creative industries was partly supplemented by the concept of cultural and creative. And this was in part the work of some institutes and policy initiatives in the EU. Mercosur countries, but particularly spearheaded by UN agencies, including UNESCO, UNCTAD, and UNDP, United Nations Development Programme. So a whole range of publications. There's a whole policy history, the UND publications such as Culture and Diversity, stressing points that Rosemary made earlier, emphasize a fundamental relationship between culture and sustainable growth and development. The first creative report saw the growth of the CCIs not as a select experience happening in northern countries, but as a broader continent-wide experience. And that was very crucial. And then UNESCO's revised framework for cultural statistics almost formalized the shift, attempt to get a better grid. But you had notions of creative industry subsisting with somewhat broader notions of cultural and creative industries. These are the UN's classifications, the UNESCO's classifications of the cultural domains and the industries. And the characteristics of culture and creative industries, if we try and just quickly look at them, the size of the company, there's a large number of freelancers and micro businesses. There's a lack of medium-sized companies, high-level entrepreneurial, the nature of products, user value, culture by nature, content-focused, intangibility, value, sometimes difficult to define and linked strongly to creativity. Labor practices, I'll say a bit more about later. Business processes, strongly project-based, network-based, less structure, and often close proximity to clients and consumers. But this itself is changing. So business models, the impact of, you had to take cognizance of the impact of the digital economy, the volatility of the market. So sectors were cross-cutting, were often fragmented. The challenge is actually to network and to find greater coordination with that. And often a lack of suitable statistics. So visioning the creative economy. And this is actually important. So it's not just saying, okay, we're going ahead and we're going to apply business models and we're going to suddenly, have a fairly, scientific and practical approach to the creative economy. It's actually far more than that. And this is also revealed in a whole range of new economic and social theory. Once I knew, some of it dates back to the 80s, but it's been revamped and integrated, and it's found its way into all sorts of new and interesting policy. Sometimes still quite technical, but certainly more comprehensive. I've talked about a tale of two airports. It's not a misspelling. It's actually, airports are actually structures which actually have airfields, but they also have manufacturing facilities, two ones. One I was involved with was in the Kucha IDZ. I was part of a team. In fact, I headed up a team to establish, to do a pre-feasibility study. So we said to Kucha, you must go ahead and do it. It's actually on your original plan. It's going to crowd in new industries. And there's some marvelous opportunities in terms of new supply lines from Chinese manufacture of aircraft. There's huge opportunities for a whole range of second-hand equipment, particularly Russian equipment, and so on and so forth. And there was also means of clustering in defense industries and other advanced industries, such as drone development and that. So it was made a strategic project. Everybody was excited about it. But it's still sitting on the stocks. So this, it's the project is, everybody says it's great, but nothing has happened, which is interesting. In Andalusia, in Spain, a little bit earlier this, and this is one of the examples we used there, they decided, they said, listen, this is near Seville. They said, listen, we want to set up an airport. And the accountants, and they said, oh no, the revenue projections don't make sense. And most people said, look, it's a bit problematic. And the project planners, the people close to it, and the visionary aspects, they said, no, we're going to do it. And they actually, the part of the conception was around that Hollywood movie, Kevin Costner's Field of Dreams, where he builds a basketball field in the middle of nowhere. And he says, people will come. And they built this. And they said, people will come. And people did come, And it became, it's now the third to second largest part of the supply chain around aircraft production, particularly Airbus production in the EU. And they took the risk. They said, we're going to do it. So orthodox economics, and particularly marginal accounting, you'll say, don't do it. And this is also an example of innovation writ large. And that what happens to the creative economy is not only happening in the creative economy, in the culture, is that these things happen creatively and wonderfully. And these spillover effects, the serendipity in that is actually impressive. So, and this is backed up by a whole range of new work in the 1990s. They've seen the increased challenge to economic orthodoxy, both in terms of theory and practice, and the emergence of a variety of new alternative approaches to matters of economic growth and development. So there's a growing interest, for example, in the nature and conditioning effects of territory or locale or terroir, if you're really into wine, and the French use it in a range of theoretical ways. The play of history. History is important. So when you're talking heritage capital, it's important. It's also identifying a place. If you look at a building and say, okay, that building's worth 150 Namibian dollars. But if a powerful person stayed there and there's a heritage component, the value can and does go up. So the perception of value changes, So this is important to take cognizance of this, to realize that we've got to step beyond the boundaries and let that imagination go. So it's not just saying we're protecting what we're doing, but just to say that creativity is actually becoming, taking on its own new forms in that. So it's important to maintain and establish creative and cultural industries. And in doing so, as I've indicated, one has to look at a wider social system. For example, Chopin and Communen, who've done a lot of work on CCI clusters, talk about making sure that these clusters are embedded in a knowledge pool. We've gone a bit more directly or extensively, and something that's coming out in new agenda that I've written is talks about the importance of looking at the economy of the imagination. And this happens not within and without the creative economy. We find some of the most amazing things happening and uncharted. For example, there's somebody who is sitting in Sea Point who makes high-end cartridges for audiophile record players, turntables, selling them at about £3,000 in the overseas market. And they're handcrafted. I mean, it's that serendipitous aspect, and you can find a lot of it in I would venture to say, in SADC countries, which have this frontier, rugged. I want to say rugged individualism, but they have this rugged quality. Let's get it done. Let's make it, and we shouldn't lose that. So we need to look beyond, within and beyond. It's important. And these kinds of developments have really been charted in looking at, in scholarship, looking at, the learning or the knowledge areas, the productive industrial districts in places like northern Italy, with the fashion, where you find high levels of fashion and design, and you're making the Ferraris and the Lamborghinis and so forth. I know Lamborghini's partly been bought out by Volkswagen, but nevertheless, still important. So you look at that, the shift away from state responsibility to plurality of actors, centralism, decentralization, top-down entrepreneurial, state co-finances, supply-oriented, demand-oriented, and so on and so forth. So those, of course, are, a touch simplistic, and reality is a bit more complex, but shows some of these shifts that happen in terms of creating productive approaches to the creative economy and the broader kinds of invocations of culture and creative work. So charting the creative economy, there's a series of propositions I thought we need to take cognizance in trying to grid strategic policy and notions of leadership, because leadership is often seen as a fairly singular, the great leader and so forth. And what we are realizing, it's actually setting up the structures and networks, connecting, collaborating, and so forth, and so on, and also planned obsolescence as well. I think it's important, and multiple roles. So notions are changing, it seems, both from the literature, but also from experience. So, but part of the process, and we've done it to an extent in setting up the South African Cultural Observatory, and this is the ideas and models and practices certainly need to be extended and networked. Conceptualizing, mapping, and intervening in the CCI sector, within or without a national economy, is more than a technical exercise. That I want to stress. But look, you need to find ways and means of locating, collecting, and interpreting data, and look at these kinds of interventions and chart them. And not just technical things of saying this is happening in the clothing industry and so forth, which is important, but look at other kinds of areas where value has been added behind the backs of the policy leaders. 2 years ago, in the early stages of the South African Cultural Observatory, I was at Plettenberg Bay travelling through, and I stopped and I talked to a person I know who used to be an ex-advisor to the South African government. We were talking about, I said, hey, we're doing this work on the creative economy. He said, what is the creative economy? And he said, I've read a bit about it. And he said, well, I always ask the question, who are the customers? And I thought it was a very deceptively simple question, because you say, well, culture is really important, and we're doing for culture. But you say, but it's one of those important questions that you ask, whether as an intellectual or social scientist, you ask yourself, who are the customers? Another one of my favorite things, I used to tell my students, I still do, does it work? Those are really important. So while there's necessary subsidization of certain enterprise and agencies within the creative economy, and dealing with a range of firms who have to turn a profit. So success rates and advanced indicators, again, to stress intellectual property central, and informed interaction and insertion into relevant value chains. Ideally, that there is an interplay, and these are not just unidirectional, that they're multidirectional. Access to funding, as Michelle knows only too well for small firms, is actually really crucial. And in developing and emerging economies, ladies and gentlemen, develop it on a budget is important. We actually need to think about this more. We always say we need state support. More state support for this and this. And if you look at the fiscus, taking a battering, look at the South African rand versus the dollar, look at the Turkish stuff, et cetera, It's development on a budget, And it's not just we have to cut our cloth, what a thing, Sometimes it's a challenge, and it's a nice challenge. So orthodox approaches don't always work. We need to work with a variety of social capital resources, identify and deploy networks and new public and volunteer spaces. Voluntary capital, voluntary involvement is so underrated, and it's something that it's very rich and substantive in the cultural creative sectors, And there's a lot to leverage there. So this kind of thinking will require new forms of bureaucrats and social entrepreneurial leadership. We can't work with existing bureaucrats. It ain't going to cut it, And so there's a lot of revision that needs to be done if one is to remain, to use a more technical term, competitive. So more attention needs to be paid to concepts such as frugal innovation, and I've been looking at some of that of late. Rajin and others in Jugaad innovation, it's actually a Hindi term, which actually is about frugal innovation. They argue that economies can learn from those entrepreneurs in India and other emerging economies who manage to be creative within a context of scarcity. So making products that are more appropriate to setting, So maybe a cheaper cell phone that works, as opposed to a 16,000 rands, 19,000, and half of that profit. We're probably talking about the big end phones. Half that profit, particularly in terms of Apple, goes to Apple. That's why the prices are so high. You're paying for the label. You're paying Ferrari prices for your phone. I'll say a bit more about that later. Yeah. So the next proposition is that the political economic context needs decoding, and this is very important. We talk about doing policy, but we actually got to take a look. What's happening? How do we leverage it? I was talking in Brazil a couple of years ago to one of the senior government administrators, and he said, Richard, I'm very keen for us to develop cabling from Brazil through to southern Africa. Currently, the cabling goes from the south to the north, it comes back here. I was just reading one of these potboiler theories, thrillers, which actually had an interesting point. It said, in the Sussex coast, a lot of the internet cabling is there. And right next to the internet cabling is actually a headquarters of GCIS, your British Intelligence Service. It's a coincidental, and apparently it was mentioned Vegas. I don't know, but certainly internet traffic is not a level playing field. And these are things we've got to look at. We're losing out. So it's surprising how quickly the giant tech companies have come to dominate the world economy via their position in the digital economy. So these mega digital platforms, and they structure what you're doing. The phone, the cell phone is actually the site of a whole range of new creative work economy. You pull it out, you're interacting with these digital platforms. And it's how you use it, how you interact with it, is actually key to vibrant local creative economies. 10 years ago, only Microsoft was among the biggest companies in the world as measured by market capitalization. Nowadays, top 5, Apple, Alphabet, that's the parent company of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. And of these, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook constitute a conundrum for governments and small and local indigenous businesses, especially in the creative industry sector. Very underrated. Currently, the tech 4 have a market capitalization of 2.8 trillion and growing. It's a GDP of France, by the way. Yeah. 24% of the Standard & Poor, that's American company index, and growing, and they pay on average less than half of the tax within America compared to other Standard & Poor companies. Some concerned commentators, including venture capitalists, have recommended a trust-busting exercise. But I'm not sure if you saw some of the media coverage of the Facebook CEO Zuckerberg being taken before the Senate, was it the Senate or the Congress hearing? But anyway, the portfolio hearing, and he ran rings around them. They didn't ask the awkward questions. I kept on saying, "Jeepers," Anyway, there's a number of the scholars have said you've got to do a trust-busting exercise, but. Some recent legal work from American scholars said, well, maybe the current state apparatus in states is not up to the task. Some steps have been taken of late by the EU Commissioner for Competition, and they've been finding, some of the fines have gone into the billions. So the relevant SADC organisations must take note. We could do with some good anti-competition considerations there. And the revenue streams for the tech giants outside the US are modest. In Ireland, I found that Facebook paid 30 million euros in tax on a revenue of 12.6 billion. So, and that is a major base outside. Can you imagine what they're paying in other countries? So that's 0.25%. I worked out. Hey? 1 over 400. Hey? So just ask yourself, whatever country in SADC you're thinking, how much? What tax revenues are being paid by the tech giants? That's interesting. So between them, Google and Facebook have over half of the world's digital advertising revenue, and don't think it doesn't impact. The Cape Town, what's the Creative Arts Centre in Cape Town, Rosemary? No, where they do the opera in that. It's Artscape. The head of the Artscape, CEO of Artscape, said to me that their brochures, they used to have substantive, a lot of advertising revenue, and he said we get so little these days. We sometimes get up to 40,000 rand, and we're lucky if we get 4,000 rand or less. 400,000 rand. So he said. And he was saying that online advertising is taking a lot of business away from local companies. That's so it's impacting on the subsidised cultural sectors as well. There it is, mapped from the recent UNCTAD study of the digital economy. If you look at the clustering of digital MNEs, multinational enterprises. Even that is a bit of a misnomer, multinational enterprises. It's best to be located in the States. It's got the best way of securing your intellectual property rights. You'll see here PayPal, which was a South African invention, and it was bought out by American concerns. Hey? It was designed here. South Africa's got Naspers, which actually holds as part of Tencent. But that is an extraordinarily revealing figure or a diagram showing how underdeveloped, relatively speaking, and the challenges that face us there. So anyway, to move to Proposition 5, work in the creative economy, it's a blueprint. It's been argued for growing experience of precarity. So people working in the gig economy, cultural economy, work hard, they're often exploited, and they still like it. I have a colleague who's sitting and she does gigs. Some of you know Amy Shelver. She's now working for UNTAG in Geneva. Has done a 3-month stint here and here. And I said, Amy, you're a classic example of somebody working in the gig economy. But it's a lot of short-term, unpaid, free labour. So how many times do you go? You go for a business drink. You often end up subsidising that, to get work. Yeah. I can go on that, but so sustaining and expanding this creative economy with its structural vulnerability places new stress on current state apparatus. So how do we regulate this? How do we develop more bespoke kinds of resource-effective funding support and, where possible, social security interventions? Brings us to the question of policy. So CCI development, the sector, cultural economy, the more generally is actually integral to economic industrial policy. Strangely enough, there's a new discussion document out in South Africa with a collaboration of the University of Johannesburg's research chair and the DTI, the Department of Trade and Industries, on the creating the smart economy and looking at transitional work. And I went through it, and I didn't find one reference to the creative economy or any work on the creative economy. No collaboration, and this was supposed to be a major policy document. So this is actually very interesting, and you probably find these kinds of situations elsewhere. How we've talked a lot about it, but often when it comes down to getting, looking at the linkages, getting it going, it doesn't always happen. But it's important, what I'm stressing, that we should be looking at how we look at this integration. And this is, I'll touch on that South African issue a bit later. So we need to take cognizance of new approaches to industrial policy, which emphasize the process of discovery, the importance of place and history, like place-based theories, smart specialization. And there's a lot of new work and talk about reversing deindustrialization in Africa and reindustrialization. But we need to couple with that, because this is what we're actually talking about, new kinds of it. Crucial to this is industrial clusters. Industrial clusters applied to the CCIs, have worked in a range of contexts. Work by Danny Roddick of the ex-World Bank, who's been looking at this reindustrialization of Africa, stresses the importance of clusters. So clusters are very important. They allow for tech transfer. I don't mean just building a cultural precinct. I mean actually functioning industrial clusters. And these you can build anywhere. You've got to get your intervention right. So we did a presentation to the Kucha IDZ, and we said this is a very good place to put it, because you get tax incentives and so forth. Yeah. So cluster is important. Towards a smart state, we've got to try and understand how we remodel the state. So a number of popular commentators have said you can't have a smart economy if you're not changing the state. The state forms have to change. So at a meta level, in regard to developing African economies, probably a shift to an administrative and productionist model is important. And in this process, smart partnerships between the public and private sectors are essential. The regional dimension, we've discussed this, and one needs to look to the regional dimension for new kinds of resources and more concerted collaborative ways of undertaking some of these common problems. 4 mega trends: artificial intelligence, virtual reality, augmented reality, blockchain. Some of them more democratic than the current digital platforms. Major trends. We've got to, whoever starts intervening in whatever country, you've got to make sure that you actually work with those. I did a presentation, funny, to the defence on the new defence strategy, and I started looking at it. And I realised in South Africa, with a somewhat shrunken defence industrial base, that the capacities and expertise in those 4 areas are primarily located in the South African defence industry. So synergies, interaction, collaboration, take some surprising bedfellows. Yeah. Rethinking education and training for the CE sector. I'm preaching to the converted. I'm not going to go into all that, but there's certainly scope for new kinds of leadership. So cultural leadership. I'm going to make a few points because I want to start closing off now. But it's interesting. There's a discourse on cultural leadership which you can find in England. It's related to new public management and so on and so forth. And the cultural leaders, trying to gear them up for cultural institutions, the major ones, not hitting targets and so forth. So there's a real history to it. But leadership itself is changing over time, and one needs to look at leadership in terms of offering a whole range of new opportunities and linkages and working collaboratively. So cultural leadership functions as a kind of floating signifier. There's not one definition. But we need to start taking risks and so forth, and look at more collaborative, relational and entrepreneurial aspects of it. Business and creative economy, we've made most of the points there. But part of the leadership is actually getting together. It's making those connections and that. And those are some more aspects of what can happen in the business thing. This will be available on the PowerPoint portal, as it were. And the state, we've talked about the state and the creative economy. The South African case, I think I'll talk about some of the examples in that. How South Africa's done work for a long time, but we've still managed to have battled to get this collaboration going. So it's something that we have to think through. I've suggested that maybe the part of the leadership is having something of a war room approach, getting people together, getting an active task team. We've got to move beyond these. I know it sounds like a cliche, but these silos and that. Concluding comments. The CCI is intervening and strengthening is not a one-off. It's not a short-term. There are some short-term opportunities. It's complicated. It's a longer-term project. The sector is cross-cutting, interdisciplinary. Interventions must take the broader socio-economic context into consideration. Need specialist research. Partnership networks and building social capital are essential. I can't stress that too much. Establishing and improving industry associations, likewise, is an undervalued aspect. You must look better in regulation of cultural work is a key part of this process. Leadership multifaceted and a shared and collective process. There are scope for charismatic leadership, don't get me wrong, for visionary. But we have to look at the variety and the different levels and look at the connections between that. And state intervention should be predicated on state reform. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. That was quite a full presentation. Can we get the roving mic? Because now we're going to open for questions. Because this was quite a full presentation, and I saw from the reaction of the participants that there's likely to be quite a lot of questions. We will allow about 20 minutes. Can we? Okay. For questions. Please, who'd like to kick it off?
All right, I'm Hannah Tarindwa. I'm founder of Writers Academy of Namibia. And what you were saying did resonate. For me, the major point maybe was on your proposition, the frugal innovation and cultural leadership. Starting with the frugal innovation, for me, it's more like a comment to say that the fortunate part of arts is that we can start with almost nothing. All you need is yourself and your art and your talent, and then you can make it, as long as the policy works. Like you were saying, that people are making decisions for the arts, and yet there's no creative economy included. As for the examples of cultural leadership, I think maybe we need to start the ground running, particularly because here in SADC and Africa at large, we have had predecessors like Chinua Achebe. But unfortunately, I was just saying to some friends of mine that if the arts industry thrives, then people will get more jobs, from the perspective that Chinua Achebe was also a doctor. If Chinua Achebe was allowed to be a pure artist and earn money, he would have made space for someone else to be a doctor. So there are a lot of artists doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. And let's get them to be doing the arts as artists. And I think maybe with cultural leadership, I would like to agree with what Tate said earlier. And he was saying that the elderly need to come in and actually teach. English people have Shakespeare to look back to. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice are Americans who did Jesus Christ Superstar. We need to actually maybe, I know we are late already, we need to start running, but let's go back to those people who did great things in the past and acknowledge them, and they can be our cultural leaders.
Well said. Thank you very much. Prof, we'll allow a couple of questions before we take comments, because it'll go quicker.
Prof, I'm here to learn as well. I'm Patrick, the chairman. I was recently asked in engaging our political leaders, which actually have, I think, in principle, interest to support the creative economy. And with your last statement, I don't know if we don't document and monitor and evaluate, the low-hanging fruits in the creative and cultural sector, but what are those low-hanging fruits? Where do we get the best bang for our buck if we have limited resources?
We'll take another one, and then Prof will comment. Right at the back. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My name is Josh Nyapimbi, Nimbe Trust, Zimbabwe. I would do a slight connection with the morning presentation where I kind of get lost. There was a mention of the 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Expressions, and now we are transitioning to creative economies. I get a bit challenged where we conflate arts and culture, and I hope with this particular session we are going to address that. Where we now, wherever it started from, I don't know, but from where I come from, there is need to distinguish what is culture and what is arts, and not use these interchangeably. And because when you come to the 2005 Convention, when you are talking about protecting the diversity of cultural expressions, and yet, on the other hand, you are using these interchangeably, it becomes very confusing. I also hope the current presenter would help us in terms of if there are any initiatives in the area of research, because I believe if this initiative is the first one and we're arguing it's the first one, I think there are certain things that we need to now start on our own terms. What does really creative economy means for Africa? What does creative economy means for SADC? Because the narrative that I've just listened to is Eurocentric. And we are far below in terms of resourcing and in terms of where we are. And now I find myself put in a situation of play catch up. But do I really need to catch up? Or I need to work at my own speed and on my own terms? I think it's about time now we define what is creative economy for Africa. What are cultural industries? Yes, there is the UNCTAD, there is the UNESCO frameworks, but what does it mean for Namibia? What does it mean for Zimbabwe? And we recognize each other in that diversity and not have a one-size-fits-all, because it's really problematic when you get on the ground and you start to work. Thank you.
Okay.
I want to make a comment, which is almost a question, because you touched on something very important in your presentation, and I think Josh also sort of mentioned it. Because for me, this summit is, we should really be asking ourselves as a region, as a SADC region, to say, what can we do to make the work of creatives easier? And one of the things I think you touched on is the issue of trade inequalities. And I think that's a very critical question for us in the SADC region now, to say, do we have enough data to understand whether there is even, what kind of trade is happening between countries? Like how many artists from Namibia are able to take their products to Zambia? How many artists from Zambia are able to take their products to Namibia? Because for me, I want to go back home and say, okay, I think for us to help our colleagues in Namibia or in the region, we have to look at these and these and these trade restrictions, entry restrictions, so that we really focus into that area. So I'm throwing this to you as a cultural observatory. I don't know if we have I don't think we have other cultural observatories in the region, maybe in Zimbabwe, but in Zambia we really don't have a specific one. I think we need to start collecting data from these different countries, which really go to the issues of trade. Because even when we start saying, as a region, how much are we exporting to other regions? How much are we exporting to the north? How much are we exporting to Europe? etc. This is very important. So maybe this is my comment and almost a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. You may respond.
Okay. So, really nice, wide-ranging set of questions and comments and observations. I'll see if I can get them consecutively and get them right. Otherwise, I'm going to ask just to remake it. The one thing about looking at the leadership and the great leaders and things like that, and there's a lot of new work coming up about the whole question of people leading tastes and developing such. And Chinua Achebe and others would actually very much fit into that, and the great artists. And the internationally respected artists. I mean, that's a key part of the landscape. I mean, but what is actually happening? Globally, whether countries in the South want to interact or not, is actually increasing beneficiation of culture, creative activity, and so forth. Whether it's actually paying, vast amounts for, a painting. Even William Kentridge's paintings now go for this absolute fortune, where people are paying these vast sums. This is a sign of how culture is actually now being embedded within a changing economy, and I think that's very important. But starting looking at locally, how do we look for local leadership and make that thing? To me, it's a spectrum, and I did try and make this particular point. It probably comes out more generally in the overall presentation that you have your vision, you have your leaderships, you have your charismatic leaders. Those are crucial, and that's part of it. And also, too, talking about Southern African countries of the South, maybe and in a more expanded version, because I'll probably be turning this into something, is to look at this. And I've written separately. Look at the whole question of the Cinderella complex, and say, going back to look at Biko, and he said, listen, we've got to start taking more seriously what we do, and that's what I've been trying to say. And it's a very important thing. So as part of the creativity, part of the art is doing that. And also in the paper, the question of subsidized cultural, or cultural kind of art people are doing, and the particularities of what is happening within a country or a region, that's important. And that keeps the vibrancy. I mean, again, there's a lovely paradox. It's precisely that indigenous vibrancy that actually makes sense in terms of value in that. So that's actually a very thing. Looking at that intrinsic quality. So that actually, in many respects, is actually has to be enhanced in that particular process. What I will say in terms of leadership is to actually look at the networks. You've got the great leaders, the charismatic at the one end, the big cultural leaders of the large structures. How are they interacting down the line? What networks do we have? What kind of training? I've touched. These are the things. Do we have cultural leadership training? Are these points being taken across? How do we inspire that? And the sort of low-hanging fruits, I think, are also very, very important to say. There are low-hanging fruits, and part of it is actually old-fashioned finding out, scoping, and researching, and saying where are they. The more you research and find out what's happening with the local industries, and you'll find opportunities, and opportunities exist.
Quite some time. Can we then get onto the issues that were raised about the Eurocentricity?
Yeah, definitely. I'm moving to that right away. The question of when we talk about the creative economy and the cultural thing, I think one needs to bear in mind that these are discussions and debates which have happened within broader international organizations, which like UNESCO and that, which have stressed, and the UNDP, which have looked to put us to broaden it, to include the African economies, to include the countries of the South. But accepting, as UNESCO does, that we've actually got to work with this term. So it's important. So it's not saying we can't do it, but it's actually, to me, more a synthetic process. So it's not saying one doesn't, can do amateur or subsidize or non-profit or look at sustaining that, and that's a hell of important. But it's actually working with a whole range of international support and interventions. At the same time, though, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they don't give enough put enough stress on cultural work. Those are the things to work for. Work in regional organizations. Broadly too, there's a lot of scope for looking at terms of trade to doing that research, to demonstrate what's happening, to understand, saying this is happening within the arts. So I do think SADC itself needs to look at some commissioned research to whether it's actually saying looking at the inequalities of trade, what's happening to indigenous art, where the process of exploitation, because I'm stressing that the exploitation is happening, and I'm saying we've actually got to be savvy, we've got to be street savvy. We can't turn our backs on the creative economy, as much as we like it. So to me, it's actually looking local and being able to work globally. Yeah.
In terms of leadership, it got me thinking a lot about whether we're talking about, the charismatic leaders or activists that would then have to fight for an opportunity to deliver their proposals and how they see things on behalf of the rest of the industry. In Namibia, we have a unique situation where you have every design from government specifically. A ministry has a responsibility to do something about the arts, whether it's roads, the ministry responsible for maintenance, even at the design of a city, town planning. Our paperwork is so well done that everybody actually has something to do for the arts and the culture. And now the question in terms of leadership is how do we, instead of creating new things, there's already these platforms, so how do we coordinate those or create a point where they all have to report, and then from that point on, at least maybe 40% of the problems would be solved because of the design of how service delivery is supposed to be in a country like Namibia. So are there any examples on how to coordinate those intergovernmental sectors? And if there are any, I think it's something we would like to know about and to see how we implement something like that in Namibia.
Thank you. Diane.
I'm Diane Dodd from Ithaca. I just want to pick up on a question that you made, which is, who are the customers? And I think that's really important for all of us. I was just reading recently that millennials are now outspending the boomer generation. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of any studies about how they're spending and what they're spending on. I know in tourism, there are studies that look at how they are spending on more participatory experiences rather than in fancy hotels. So they're looking at maybe saving money by going to Airbnb, but they're spending more money on experiences, learning to cook or taking courses in jewelry making, et cetera, et cetera. So I was thinking about those types of creative economies that are much more local, and maybe that artists can benefit from more in terms of creative tourism or experience tourism or living with it tourism. And I just wondered if you've got any references to that, because you just mentioned it very briefly. So that's my question.
Thanks, Prof. You can respond.
Yeah. Well, the key thing about getting the question of leadership, to me, is actually to start looking at creating networks and structures and getting together and starting to talking about them. Maybe doing a scan and saying, what courses do we offer? There's an expanding set of university courses, maybe to get universities, tertiary institutions to come up with courses, look at in-house training. I would think that is a fairly cost-effective way of getting it, to actually get it on a agenda, have a conference, look at leadership, but maybe look at alliances. A lot of the creative work is actually done on a local or a sub-national, certainly a regional basis. That seems to work. It's often difficult getting a national one, so you've got to work regional. But you've got to look at linkages over and above it. Getting back to the question of the creative economy, the creative economy doesn't only belong to whatever thing, but this is a global development. It's happening in South Africa. It's actually constructed within and without formal established arts, cultural, heritage spaces. And it's how one actually interacts with that and looks at the dichotomy and looks at that paradox and exploits that paradox, is what I'm also saying. I think is actually important. But creating leadership, it's raising consciousness, developing the networks, and saying, let's actually do this in a cost-effective way, but in a beneficial way. I've noticed a whole range of what they call creative alliances in booming regions that have got substantive creative economies. So I'd say look at creative alliances, or creative leadership alliances, and see what actually happens, because there's often some serendipitous development in that. And despite a range of initiatives, leadership is actually fairly low down, in terms of actual thinking about it and action. So that's what I'd say. Let's say maybe even this conference could actually get some initiative going on that. But a lot of but I'll just repeat, a lot of that happens at local and regional, small regional level from my experience.
So just respond to the Namibian gentleman who was talking about the service delivery and the cross-departmental work.
Well, that sounds like a good one, because what you're talking about is a question of procurement. That various government departments, and whether national or local level, are looking at utilising local artists, local cultural producers in terms of the procurement. And it doesn't happen sufficiently, I know, in South Africa. And I think we probably are underestimating the power of procurement. And bear in mind, though, in a lot of countries in the South and developing economies, procurement is actually a means of capital gain. So it has to be struggled for. It doesn't happen. But I think it's a marvellous idea, and it's something. I've got a master student, funny, of working on procurement, and I'll actually ask him a bit about it and feed that back. But I think procurement linked to improving the employability of local cultural producers, workers, artists. And I do talk about looking at some also small forms of social security in the paper. So I think it's a good idea. The Namibian governments, I think other SADC members should take cognizance of that and see how they can institute it more. And we should maybe come up with more of a debate around that.
Question about millennials?
I'm going to move to that.
And then the last one, the difference between the cultural economy, the creative economy.
Yeah.
In short.
Yeah. The question of the millennial spending. There are quite a range of studies. I haven't specifically noted. I've got a couple of notes that I've said back of it on, saying, here's something arguing. I know UNTAG are dealing with some youth and youth demographics and spending. So what I'll do is put you in touch with the person who knows about that and do that. And it's starting to percolate through in terms of the more general literature, not necessarily on cultural consumption, but more on consumption per se. But it sounds to me like a good piece of research to do. I think the observatory should look for that as an additional project. Because often when you work with government, you have a whole range of predetermined research outputs in that. But I can chat to you further on that score.
The difference between the cultural economy, creative economy. And then that'll be a wrap.
I think when one's looking at some of the more, when you're talking about the cultural economy, you're looking at some of the more traditional, arts, culture, heritage spaces, where you've actually had performing arts and you've actually had older cultural industries. With the creative industries, you're also bringing into play a number of industries like design, industrial design, which use more of the digital platforms and so forth. But as I indicated, with the classifications, they vary, and it's a fluid situation. What one also sometimes bearing in mind is that all the international classifications have cultural, look at cultural industries and creative industries. If one's looking at more kind of culture which doesn't exist, which doesn't necessarily have a formal industrial form. It could be somebody doing amateur art, and maybe that there is scope for that, but some of those are different conceptions, and maybe there are debates. There's one debate to say let's uncouple the cultural industries from this broader creative industries, which are more industry wide, because the creative economy is not just confined to people working in formally defined. It's expanding, is what I'm saying. Is that the creativity and innovation are being now writ large. So that's an unresolved debate internationally. And it would be nice to actually have that debate brought into forums and engagement. But I think the big forums to do are Africa and UNESCO and so forth. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Much appreciated. You may step off the stage. Well done. Can we give Professor Haynes a round of applause?